In this video, we'll be discussing some tips and strategies for strengthen and weaken questions. It won't be comprehensive, we won't cover everything to do with these question types, but we'll cover the basics and the most important tips that will definitely help raise your score. In addition, this video is for any level. So if you're just starting out, if you have a low score, let's say 140s, 150s, or even if you have a super high score in the 170s and you're looking for those last couple points, then this video will still be helpful. So without further ado, let's look at tip number 1. So tip number 1, know what to look for. So if you look at the screen, there's an example question stem for a weakened question. So let's read it. Which one of the following, if true, would most weaken the argument at hand? So the operative word in this is argument. So they mention argument, not conclusion. So sometimes the error that occurs is you focus on the conclusion and you're like, oh, I want to weaken this conclusion, which is true to a degree, but there's a little bit more nuance to it. You want to weaken the whole argument as a whole. So you want to understand the premises and how they get to the conclusion, and you want to weaken that process. So it's a minor detail, but it makes a big difference. So let's look at a simple example to get this idea across. Jackie is a devoted fan of the iconic film Nostalgic Echoes. Its intricate narrative infused with the stylistic elements and sophisticated dialogue of early 60s cinema has always captivated her. Whispering Shadows is a new film that masterfully blends complex storytelling with the same sophisticated cinematic techniques. Its script is clever and filled with puns and sardonic humor, reminiscent of Nostalgic Echoes' best moments. Given Jackie's love for Nostalgic Echoes, she is bound to be enthralled by Whispering Shadows. So in this case, the conclusion is she is bound to be enthralled by Whispering Shadows. And let's say they want us to strengthen this. So even though that's the conclusion, we want to make sure that she's actually enthralled by this movie. We want to understand the process in which they got to that conclusion. And in this case, the process is of comparison. They're comparing these two movies, and from that, they get to conclusion. So most likely the correct answer, if there were answers in this case, would something that would further that comparison, that would strengthen their conclusion and make the whole argument a lot more consistent. So in simple terms, just remember you're looking to strengthen or weaken the whole argument and not just the conclusion. And okay, so let's look at tip number 2. And this tip is outside info is A-okay. So if you look at this example question stem for a strengthen or weaken question, it states which one of the following, if true, most strengthening argument. In this case, if true is very important. So basically, all the answers you could assume to be true. You don't have to doubt them. They just tell you that this information is true. And from there, you can decide whether this actually weakens, strengthens, or perhaps does nothing towards the argument. And this is also true for all strengthen and weaken questions. They always have this claim. So you don't have to worry whether it's there or not. It's always going to be there. But it's good just to double check, just read closely. And more generally, you should always read closely the whole argument, but also the initial question. So tip number 3 is doubt is fine. So it's good to remember that for these type of questions, they are not a must be true. We're just trying to strengthen or weaken the argument. So to better understand this principle, we'll look at an example. So let's say you're a detective and there's 3 suspects and you believe it's person A. But you don't know for a fact. There's also suspect B and C. So let's say we cancel out C. That person has an alibi or something of the sort, and we know for a fact that person is innocent. So that would strengthen your case because instead of being 1 out of 3, now it's 1 out of 2. But at the same time, it doesn't definitively prove your case because there's still suspect B. Maybe he did it, or maybe in fact you are correct, suspect A did it, but you're not exactly sure. But at the very least, the case is strengthened. So that's how you want to think about these problems. If it's strengthened, you're not trying to say, oh, it's 100% true. And on the flip side, a weaken, you're not trying to say, oh, it's 100% incorrect. You're just trying to get it stronger in the specific direction that they're asking. So tip number 4 is be creative and be a friend. It might be confusing what that even means, but don't worry, we'll explain. So if you look on the screen, there's a diagram, and basically it's this chart that goes from 1 to 10. And you can think of this chart as describing like how strong or weak the answer choices are. So for example, if we're dealing with a strengthening question, a number 1 wouldn't do anything, and 10 would be extremely powerful strengthening answer. So basically, it's ranking the answers from worst to best. Okay, with that said, let's say you're doing a problem and you go through the answers and you rank them as follow: A as a number 5, B as a number 4, C as number 2, D as a number 1, and E as 2. So C, D, and E are the worst, you cancel them out, and now you're down to A and B, which are very close to each other. And from there, you might have some trouble because they're so close. You think, oh, A is better, but it's barely better. And even though it's better, it's still a 5, which isn't too great. And then you're like, well, did I do something wrong? What's going on here? Is A really, in fact, the correct answer? So there's a strategy to overcome this. So in broad terms, for strengthen and weaken questions, they don't really put, or rather, they don't really make them difficult by having two answers very close to each other. There's usually going to be one that stand out from the rest. That is, like, once you properly understand it, it's like, yes, this one's definitely better than all the rest. So you're not going to see two answers that are very close in terms of how good they are. Rather, how they make it difficult is the answer, or the correct answer, is going to be unappealing at first, but on a closer examination, you might see something you didn't notice, and then you're like, aha, actually, this might be a good answer. And now finally, we can understand the title. So if you look at the bottom right, we have the advised answer list, and we could see A and B are not, in fact, the correct answer, but instead E is. Initially, we thought it was a 2, but actually, it's at 8. So, for these very hard strength and weaken questions, if you ever see an answer choice that seems very unappealing, you're like, well, they never mentioned that. What does that have anything to do with anything? And you just cross it out? Well, that's a big mistake. You should be a friend to every answer. So, even though it seems bad at first, doesn't mean it actually is bad. So, always investigate each answer choice, no matter what. And then you want to be creative, because it might not strengthen or weaken it directly, but it could do an indirect way or roundabout way. And you might have to think outside the box a little bit. And if you do that, you might surprise yourself. Answer choice might seem bad at first, but after you go through this process, like, oh, actually, that is in fact the correct answer. So the strategy is very helpful once you get to the harder questions, like in the late teens, like 18, 19, or the 20s. And with that, we could look at the next tip. So tip number 5 is be preemptive. So we need to dissect the argument, break it apart, try to find flaws or other considerations. And why do we do this? We do this to get a fundamental understanding of the argument. And the opposite of this would be reading too quickly. Basically, you read the argument, find the conclusion, you're like, oh, okay, and you go straight to the answers. And because you didn't get a good understanding, once you look at these answers, it's hard to determine which one's correct. So definitely do not do that. Instead, take your time with the argument. And when you go through this process, often you'll find something where it actually does weaken it from your own mind. And sometimes that is in the answer. So that would be very nice. And on the other hand, if it isn't in the answers, let's say they weaken in a different direction, well, since you go through this process, you have a better understanding of what's going on. So you have better context. And therefore, you can analyze these answer choices more thoroughly and fundamentally get the correct answer. And finally, we have the last tip. Tip number 6, twist the conclusion. And this is mostly for weakened questions rather than strengthened questions. So I'll give you an example so you get the idea. So we have our conclusion. The recent decline in our water quality was caused by the introduction of fracking in our district. So now we could twist it so that we could analyze it from a different direction. So basically it would be maybe something else caused the decline in water quality. And the purpose of this is basically we want to understand it from a different angle. And sometimes by looking at this different angle, we'll see something we didn't see initially. And from that, we could get the correct answer. And also be mindful. Tip number 1 was we're trying to weaken and strengthen the argument. So when you do this process, still be mindful of the process or the premises that lead to the conclusion. But even so, this tip is very helpful. And that's it. So I hope these tips are helpful. And if you have any further questions, just let us know.